So one of the things I want to say before we get into this section on methods is the language that we use about theories. Theories, anybody can have a theory. There's all kinds of theories. Theories about relationships between all kinds of variables. You have a theory about why the crime rate goes up. You have a theory about why people vote for Trump. You have a theory about, why this pandemic is impacting so many people. That's great. That's great. But you have to do the second part. You have to do the second part, which is, if you remember the Enlightenment, you got a rational idea, which would be a theory. The second part is empiricism. That's right, you remembered. Very good, student. You have to do research. You have to do research to see if there is evidence for that theory. So let me just mention the language of this. Is that in science, social science, or any science, we never really prove anything. When anybody says, I'm going to prove this, or I've proven my theory, you don't prove anything. You just find evidence for it. You don't find evidence for it. You find evidence for your theory through doing research. So, gravity is a theory, right? We don't know, like, if I were to, this Solange record, Beyonce's sister, if I drop it, I'm not going to drop it because I love this record too much. I'll drop the beat. Boop. Why does it go down? Boop. The theory is that the earth is bigger than Solange and pulling the record towards it. That's the theory. I don't know, because it could be little fairies pulling Solange towards my floor. I don't know. But I have evidence over and over again of dropping things and looking at the celestial orbits that gravity is probably a real thing. But we might find out that it's not, that we've been wrong all along. It's been little fairies all along. So we are never proving anything, but we need research to find the evidence for the theory. So the second part of this is the methodology by which we do social scientific research. And I'm going to talk about, a bunch of this is in chapter 2 in Gideon, so please make sure you've read that chapter. But I want to talk about four dominant methodologies, four methodologies that we use to do this research. Okay, number one methodology are experiments. This is something that's also common in psychology. We like to do experiments. Experiments are ways of controlling settings to measure variables. So the most famous one, and I think most people are familiar with, is the theory that the more violent TV you watch, or the more violent media you consume, the more violent you will become, especially for children. And they've done this experiment 1,000 times. And what you do in a laboratory setting is you take a bunch of kids, group A, and you have them watch some violent cartoons, Mutant Ninja Turtles. I don't know what the violent cartoon of the moment is. And then you have those kids watch the violent cartoons, and you turn them loose into the playroom, and they pick up the violent toys and they beat the crap out of each other. You take group B and you have them watch non-violent, like we try in this house, like Daniel Tiger. Teletubbies, does anybody remember the Teletubbies? Big hugs. And you have them watch the non-violent, and you turn them loose in the toy room, and they're building blocks and hugging each other, not being violent. So there's evidence, right? That's a classic scientific experiment. It fails all the time because in the real world, we don't live in a laboratory. We know that the impact of media is sort of transitory, very short-lived. I know that I have come out of action-adventure movies all charged up and wanted to go, save the day. I've come out of romantic comedies and been like, oh, love, and then, a bird flies by and you're thinking about something else. But those types of laboratory settings try to find evidence for those theories. They're problematic because we don't live in a laboratory, but there are at least ways of exploring the impact of some potentially independent variables. And I'll give you an example of a really famous one, and then I'm going to point to a link for it, is after World War II, when the reality of the Holocaust started coming out, and people started thinking, "Oh my God, what have we, the human race, done?" And the mass murder that was happening, including people being led into gas chambers and being put into ovens. Like, how could human beings do this? It wasn't just Germans; these were human beings. And by the way, it wasn't Hitler. Hitler didn't kill anybody. It was all these rank and file people under Hitler and his military that were pushing millions of people into ovens. How could this happen? How could good people do such a horrific thing? So there's this guy, Stanford psychologist named Stanley Milgram, who wanted to do an experiment to try to understand why the Holocaust happened. And it was a very simple setup in the early 1960s. So let me give you the little bit of the language of social experiments. You have the subject, the person who you're interested in experimenting on. You have the experimenter who's doing the experiment, and then you have you might have a confederate, who's someone who's sort of in on the experiment, but the subject doesn't know. So if you've ever seen Punk'd, I think Punk'd is back, right? Isn't Punk'd back with Chance the Rapper? These sort of, I remember the Ashton Kutcher version where you had a celebrity and you wanted to play a prank on them. So one of my favorite ones, Beyonce, let's mention Beyonce again, was Beyonce was supposed to be doing a celebrity lighting of a Christmas tree. And the thing was, when she pulled the switch to light the tree and all these underprivileged kids were there, the tree fell on the kids. And of course, the kids were in on the prank. They were Confederates. They were sort of working for Ashton Kutcher. And the joke was how Beyonce, not knowing that she was being pranked, would respond when she thought she killed all these little kids with the Christmas tree. It was so funny. Anyway, so that's the idea of an experiment, is you have people that are in it. Okay, so back to Milgram, 1961, the Holocaust. Milgram brought in two people who were supposedly doing an experiment on learning techniques. And they were told they were going to be participating in the study about how people learn. One was the subject. The other one, the subject thought was also a subject, but was also a Confederate, was in on what was really going on. And so the subject was brought into a room and told, you're going to sit here behind this screen. And I'll have the link to the video so you can see it. And you're going to read these words to the other subject, again, who's the Confederate, on the other side of the screen. And if they get the words right, if they read them back to you right, they get a little green light. But if they get it wrong, you have to push a button and it gives them a mild electronic shock. And so the person was sitting there, the subject, with another person in a white lab coat saying, okay, go, let's do the first one. Read these words, and the other person reads the words. And if they get it wrong, the person in the white coat says, okay, give them the shock. And the person on the other side goes, ow! But in fact, they're not connected to anything. It's all an act. They're being punked. And so what they found in this experiment, that they would keep sort of ratcheting up the wattage. The guy in the white lab coat would say, go forward, more wattage. And the person on the other side, the Confederate, would scream, ow, louder when they got it wrong. And of course, the person who is the subject is like, I don't know what's going on here. And the person in the white lab coat would say, the experiment must continue. I take responsibility, continue. And they would keep turning up the wattage till the person on the other side was saying, stop it, I want out of here, I'm having a heart attack, please, stop. And the white guy in the white lab coat would say, the experiment must continue. And here's the crazy thing, in 65% of the cases, and these subjects were a range of people, including other professors, who didn't know what the experiment was really about, in 65% of the cases, the people would go all the way to the end, to the possibility they had killed the person on the other side of the screen. 65% went all the way. Why? Because somebody in a white lab coat said, do it. Because somebody in a position of authority who said, I'll take the responsibility, you do it, you pull the trigger, essentially. It was mind-blowing. It really shocked the world and how average people would surrender their moral compasses and literally believe that they were killing someone because somebody in a position of authority told them to do it. Milgram's experiment really helped us understand why the Holocaust happened. It was very valuable. I'm going to talk about the ethics of that in a little bit, but that experiment was really useful. So experiments can be, very, very useful, even though we don't live in a laboratory. There's also this thing that you want to look at called the Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect is when the subject knows what the experiment is all about. It's based on this study that was done in an electrical plant called the Hawthorne electrical plant, where people were told, hey, we're going to be doing this experiment and it's about this. And of course, everybody wanted to please the researcher. So they acted that way. So this is why the subject has to be kind of kept in the dark, where in an experiment they can't know what it's really about, or else they will respond in an pure, honest way, right? You want to get sort of the pure reaction. So experiments, pretty useful. The big one that we use in sociology, probably the most common methodology that we use, is the survey. We love giving surveys. We give surveys all the time. Surveys are used to sort of collect two types of information. You've probably taken a survey. You know, the idea is the survey is anonymous, right? You don't put your name on it. And we do surveys to kind of measure two things. One is your past behavior. Ever have I ever, right? So we give a lot of people surveys about their criminal behavior. Have you ever stolen something? Have you ever beaten somebody up? Have you ever, you know, driven over the speed limit? I mean, there's just sort of all these sort of surveys that we give. In my criminology class at Portland State, I always gave a crime survey on the very first day. They always thought it was a quiz, but it was just a survey. I want to know how criminal my students are. And of course, as we find out, everybody is a little bit criminal. We'll talk about that. So surveys can be a lot of surveys about sexual behavior. How do we know how many people have had homosexual experiences? We do these surveys and we find out a lot of people have had homosexual experiences. A lot. And so, you know, we ask people about their behavior. Have you ever traveled? Have you ever, you know, changed schools? I mean, there are all these kind of behaviors that we can ask. It doesn't have to be about sex and murdering. Okay, so the other thing we can measure is attitudes. How do you feel about this? How do we know how racist Americans are? How do we know how sexist Americans are? How do we know how much they support the president? Right? That's an attitude. How likely are you to vote for President Trump in November? How do you think he's doing a good job? Right? That's an attitude. You've seen all these surveys. Apparently the coronavirus has bumped his numbers up a little bit because people are panicking and they're looking for somebody to save them. Now they're going back down because it turns out he's not saving anybody. So those attitudes, and one of the ways that we survey attitudes is something called a Likert scale. A Likert scale, and you might have seen these on surveys where you are taking a survey, and it might ask you on a scale of sort of 1 to 5, you know, how much do you agree with this? So it could be something about universal health care. Would you like to see universal health care in America? Everybody has health insurance, like most of the rest of the world. Everybody has health insurance. 5, hell yes. 1, hell no. 3, I'm in the middle. You know, a lot of people are probably 4s on that one. Some people are 2s. So we can actually come up with a number, what we would call an index, to measure how people think about these things. That's how we measure how religious people are, how much they, you know, participate in their communities, right? On a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 or 1 to 10, we can use a Likert scale to measure attitudes. And so a lot of these polls we have about the president and the presidential contenders, including Bernie, poor little gin and juice out for Bernie, are done through these sort of attitude polls. Okay, so this is a really important piece of this, and this is going to relate to an assignment that you're going to get a little bit later in the quarter. When we're talking about surveys, research in general, but when we're talking about surveys, the concept of sampling is very important. Sampling. What do I mean by sampling? Well, hi. So when we talk about sampling, we really have to talk about, first of all, our population. Concept of population. Population is the group of people that we're interested in. So for a lot of these things about, you know, the president, the population is the United States of America citizens. You know, do citizens like their president? The population could be the population of college students. How do college students feel about debt and all the debt that they develop while they're in school, including from tuition and books and, you know, housing? What about PCC students? Well, how do PCC students, that could be our population. PCC students, how do PCC students feel about the price of books or online education? Hi, online education. Populations tend to be really big, and it's hard to survey everybody. If you want to ask, how do Americans feel about Trump? There's 300 million plus Americans in this country. That's a lot of surveys to give out, right? So we can't survey the whole people. And there's probably 25,000 PCC students, so that's still a whole bunch. So what we need is a sample. We need a smaller version of that population. We need a sample of the population. And what we want is a sample, and this is key here, a sample that is representative of the population. So for example, let's say that I'm interested in what Americans think about Donald Trump, right? This is a popular question. And I go to Pioneer Square, Portland. I find some young people who are all dressed in black with anarchy signs on them and dreadlocks, and I say, hey, I'm doing a survey. What do you guys think of Donald Trump? And they're like, fuck that asshole. And I'm like, oh, Americans generally disapprove of Donald Trump. What have I done wrong? Can I go to the mainstream media and say, yeah, I did a survey and I found that Americans really hate Donald Trump? No, because I don't have a representative sample. I have a very small sample. It's very skewed. If it's Portland, anarchist, right? They're probably not. If I were to do the exact same survey and I were to go to the Clackamas Town Center, I'm just stereotyping here, and I were to find some people in very fancy cars in the parking lot, just, getting into their cars, and I say, excuse me, what do you think of Donald Trump? And they would say, oh, we think he's doing a wonderful job. Do you have any Grey Poupon? I did a survey of Americans and they love Donald Trump. What have I done wrong, right? I don't have a representative sample. I need a representative sample. If I'm interested in what we'll take the population down. If I'm interested in what PCC students think about online education, and I ask, two students waiting for a bus in front of Rock Creek, what do they think? What do they think about now that we're doing? I guess they're not at Rock Creek because they rode a bus to Rock Creek and they couldn't get in because it's all shut down. What do you think about online education at PCC? And they're like, we hate it. It's not a representative sample, right? I need to make sure that my sample looks as much like my population as possible. So that means I need to know a little bit about the demographics, the makeup, the social makeup of my population. So if I'm doing PCC students and I know that half of PCC students are male and half are female, I need to make sure that my sample is probably half male and half female. If I know that a third of my PCC students are first generation students that are the first members of their family to go to college, I should make sure a third of my sample are first generation students. If I know that 20% of PCC students are Asian, I should try to make sure that my sample is 20% Asian. I want my sample to look as much like the population as possible. I want it to be representative. And one of the ways that we do this is through something called random sampling. If everybody in the population has the equal chance of ending up in the sample, how do we do these phone surveys about Donald Trump that you see, about his popularity that's done by CNN and Fox News and Gallup and all these news polls? They have a computer that randomly generates phone numbers, and they will randomly call up 10,000 people, not 200,000 people, but 10,000 people, and be like, what do you think about Donald Trump? And they will get a representative sample, close to it, right? You don't get babies who are also in America. You don't get people who are on ventilators who are also Americans who can't give their opinion. A lot of those at the moment. But you can get something that's close to a representative sample. So important, so important. I mean, so many times when we do research, we say, well, what was your sampling technique? Did you get a representative sample? Because a lot of the research, there's this great quote from Mark Twain that says there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. You can fudge a sampling method and prove anything that you want to prove. If I want to prove that Donald Trump is loved by everybody, I can go into the most conservative part of the country and survey 100 people there, and they're all going to say Donald Trump is the greatest thing in the world, and I've got 100% approval rating. If I want to prove that he's the most hated president in the world, I can go to Pioneer Square. I can go to some place, that's very, very liberal and survey 100 people there, and they'll be like, he's the worst. Well, Well, it's not a representative sample. We really have to be intellectually honest as scientists and make sure that our samples are representative. I can't stress that point enough, because there is bad research out there that proves, or at least has evidence of some point that somebody wanted to make, and it's because they didn't do good sampling. They don't have a representative sample of their population. You got to be clear about. Say it, Randy. You got to be clear about what your population is, and you got to be clear about what your sampling method is. Okay, so that's surveys. Um, a lot of polls are really useless, I have to say. The third methodology is ethnographic research. Ethnographic research, which we also refer to as field research. This is going into the field and studying people in their natural environment. And sometimes, you can't always get the truth of how people think and act and react in a laboratory. Surveys aren't always great, because you could take a survey and then 5 minutes later your attitude changes, right? What if I take a survey about, guns, my idea about guns, and I think, and I sign up, guns are bad, and then, somebody breaks into my house, and then if I had taken that survey after somebody broke into my house, my attitude on that survey might have been completely different. So surveys are limited. They just capture moments in time. Ethnographic research allows you to go into the field and spend time with your subjects, sort of like the woman Jane Goodall who goes into the jungle to study gorillas in the mist. This is going into the field. My favorite ethnographic study was by this guy named Leon Festinger, and it was in his book When Prophecy Fails. This is the guy that coined the term cognitive dissonance. Have you ever heard of cognitive dissonance? How people can hold kind of two opposite ideas in their head at the same time. Like, the perfect example of cognitive dissonances are people who smoke, right? Who think, well, I know smoking is bad for you, but it's not going to hurt me. Why? Because I don't have cancer in my family, or I only smoke when I drink, or I eat limes, so I'll be okay. Whatever it is. Like, people can hold two completely opposite ideas in their head. So what Fessinger was interested in I think in the early 60s was UFO cults. And we've had a lot of these. I mean, I've experienced a few over my lifetime where people think a UFO is coming to the planet, and it's going to take a bunch of people off the planet. And so we had one in the late 90s called the Heaven's Gate cult, where they thought a UFO was behind the Hale-Bopp comet, and this little group of people thought if they leave their physical bodies, they can join the UFO before the comet destroys the Earth. And they all took poison, and they were wearing Nikes, so just do it. And they died. So because they thought their physical bodies were keeping them from joining the. Anyway, so what there's ways that Fessinger could have investigated this. I mean, he was interested in what happens when this UFO doesn't come. I mean, there was a belief that there was sort of these good aliens and these bad aliens, and there was going to be kind of a war and floods on Earth that was going to destroy the planet. And this sort of cult leader said, since we know about it, we're going to be saved by the good aliens and get off the planet. And the planet will be destroyed. So let's get rid of everything that we own. And so, you could give these people a survey. You could put them in a laboratory. But he said, what if I pretend that I'm one of them? What if I join this UFO cult? Then I can be there when the world doesn't end, and I can see how they make sense of it. So he joins this UFO cult, and they're all getting rid of everything, and they're telling everybody the world's going to end, join us, you'll be safe. There's going to be fires and earthquakes, and so they go to the hilltop when it's supposed to be the pickup time, when they're supposed to be picked up by the aliens before the Earth is destroyed. And they're all sitting on that, like, okay, here it is, this is it, this is the moment we've been waiting for. And, let's say they're coming at midnight, and they're looking at their watches, and no UFOs are there, and then they're like, well, let's give them an hour. Maybe it's like daylight savings time, so they wait another hour, and there's no UFO. And they're all looking at each other and like, well, maybe they're a little late. Let's give them till morning, And so, of course, the UFO never comes, and he's with this group of people, and the normal reaction would be like, oh shit, we are the biggest idiots in the world. What the hell have we done with our lives? No, he got to see the process of cognitive dissonance. What they did was They rationalized it. They realized what they constructed was, since they had been screaming and yelling and sounding the alarm about, this alien battle that was coming, they had scared off the bad aliens, and they had saved the planet from this destructive intergalactic war that was going to happen. So they weren't idiots. They were the saviors of our planet, and we should thank them. And he got to be there because he was inside the cult to watch them construct this narrative about how they were not, in fact, idiots. They were, in fact, the saviors of the planet. Brilliant, brilliant. You could only do that from inside. So my research, which we'll talk about a little bit later on racist skinheads, and I spent on and off 5 or 6 years undercover in the white supremacist movement. I went to a lot of Klan rallies. I went to a lot of skinhead hangouts, drank a lot of beer. And the idea is the only way I can understand why these people are becoming a member of the subculture is to join the subculture, is to actually see it from the inside and have these casual conversations, because they're super paranoid. If I just showed up and said, hey, I'm from Emory and I want to talk to you, they would have been like, nope, you are the enemy, we're not going to talk to you. But since I was hanging out with them and moshing with them and going to shows and drinking beer with them, and I was briefly singing in a skinhead band, which we won't go into, I got to learn all about them and their life choices. And so that was a version of ethnographic research. And some ethnographic research can be done just by observation. You don't have to actually join a phenomenon, go undercover. You could go, to a rally. You could go to I was going to say a Joe Biden rally. Are there such things as Joe Biden rallies? I imagine there must be. And do an observation about how people organize themselves. Who's in the front, who's in the back. And the idea is that instead of it being in a laboratory or on a survey, you are in the people that you're studying. That's the idea of ethnographic research. That's why we call it field research. Okay, that's number 3. Number 4 is, in a way, the kind of easiest way of doing research, which is using existing data. Data that's already out there. And there's tons of data that's out there. Let's talk about Durkheim. Durkheim did this right on his study on suicide. He didn't go out and survey anybody. He went to churches and looked at church records. Think about all the data that's out there, the census data that everybody's talking about. We have data on how many people are in emergency rooms because of COVID-19. That's data. How many people have car insurance? That's data. Car insurance companies keep data on how many cars are stolen and what types of cars that are stolen. That's data. There's data about health issues. How do we know that there's a disparity among people based on their race, on who's dying of the coronavirus, right? We have data from hospitals that gives us this data. There's tons of data that's already out there. There's data that's been collected in other surveys. So there's a way of doing research where you're just analyzing data that's already there. So when the 2020 census comes out, one of the things that we will be looking at is the fact that Portland is becoming a whiter city. Portland is becoming less diverse because of something called gentrification and the cost of living in Portland. We will be able to look at that data and we'll be able to look at 2 variables. As the amount of money comes into the city, the amount of people of color decreases. They are negatively correlated. Higher property values equal lower rates of diversity. And that's something that's been a pattern for the last 20 or 30 years in the city. So we will be able to look at that data without going out and collecting it by just, going online and pulling up the data and analyzing the data. I had an advisor in college who did a lot of his research online, looking at surveys that other people had given to young people especially. And I was out in the field. I was out in the field doing ethnographic research with skinheads, and we were both doing research, but doing very different methods. He was sort of analyzing data from previously administered surveys, and I was getting drunk with racist skinheads. But we were both doing research. So the already existing data is a great way of doing research. Durkheim did that, and a lot of people use that. Okay, real briefly, I just want to talk a little bit about one of the problems associated with doing this type of research. Because you think about research that's done on animals, research that's done on, cells, research that's done on chemicals. I mean, there's all kinds of research that you can do. More than all the others, even more than animals, there are ethical concerns. There are ethical issues when we are researching people. There are ethical concerns because we have human subjects. I mean, think back to the Stanley Milgram study. What do you think the people who were the subjects in that study felt about themselves when they were told, this isn't about, you didn't kill anybody, you didn't shock anybody, this is all about trying to understand why the Holocaust happened. The person on the other side of the screen was a Confederate, they're not connected to anything. What do you think they felt about themselves, especially the 65% that thought they had killed the person on the other line? They probably were pretty depressed, right? Some of those may have been like, oh my God, how different am I from the Nazis? I'm not any different at all. We can't do that research now because of ethical concerns. So we really have to worry about harming subjects. We have to make sure that our subjects aren't hurt. Just think giving a survey. You know, if I'm giving a survey and it's asking people about sexual victimization, have you ever been the victim of sexual abuse, right? I may traumatize a person just by sticking a survey question in front of them and they're like, oh, thanks for reminding me that I was a victim of sexual violence when I was 10 years old, and now, you know, I'm in a state of distress. So even a survey can be used. So there is that issue. We also want to make sure that subjects are confidential, so the information on them doesn't get out. When I was doing my research on skinheads, one of the things I had to agree to do is to burn all my interviews, all the interviews, any data I had that had anybody's name on it had to be destroyed. We don't want somebody to get the information that I had recorded and go after and hurt somebody. So maintaining confidentiality. There's a famous study called the tea room tray that I often talk about. There was a guy studying in the 1970s sort of random gay hookups in the New Jersey Turnpike men's rooms. Because in those days, right, I mean, people had to keep it on the down low. And so he was sort of exploring how that happened by serving as a lookout while these men would meet up in these restrooms, and then following these guys home and getting more information from them. Really problematic. Wasn't very confidential at all. And then also about, you know, what's the goal of the research? Why is the research being done? Is it being done for scientific purposes, or is it being done to oppress people? There was, in the 1960s, something called Project Camelot that the government wanted to understand. The federal government, under the Johnson administration, wanted to understand why all these Marxist revolutions were happening around the world, especially in Latin America, and they hired all these social scientists to understand why are all these countries having these very left-wing revolutions, places like Guatemala and El Salvador. And then the researchers find out that the reason the government wanted to do that is they wanted to know what the cause of it was so they could stop the revolutions. And of course, the revolutions were about feeding people and empowering people and throwing off oppression. And so were the researchers helping the government to further oppress these people? So they canceled Project Camelot. So there are a lot of ethical concerns around this type of research. And so these are themes that we're going to come back to as we talk about social science. But we also want to just keep in mind, what's the methodology? How is this research done? Did it have a representative sample? Were there ethical issues involved? Is it good science? Okay, that's it for me on Easter morning. I'm going to go color some Easter eggs with my 5-year-old. Peace and love. Be good to each other. And the day is about, what is the theme of today? Rebirth? So we're going to be reborn out of this. We're going to come out of the coronavirus like beautiful Easter eggs that have just been crapped out by a pink bunny. Something to look forward to. All right. Thanks, everybody.